Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I am Katie Karkek. I am one of the programming librarians at the Scarsdale Library, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Adele tonight. Um, Adele Myers grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, and has a journalism degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She currently works in advertising and lives in Brooklyn, New York with her husband, son, and their rescue dog, Chipper, who I
He
just
just
heard.
he just made himself known. Yes, hopefully he'll behave himself.
The
I can't promise.
Tobacco Wives is her first novel. So, Adele, I will hand it over to you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, first of all, Katie, for inviting me to speak with you all, and thank you for everyone who is on tonight. As Katie said, my debut novel is The Tobacco Wives, and actually, one of my writing teachers, who I've known for 20 plus years, when she saw the cover, she said it made her think of a Lily Pulitzer dress with a hand grenade in the pocket. And I thought that was such a great description and kind of the tone that I was hoping to strike with this, and kind of also revealing about the story inside as well. So I thought I would give you just a little bit of an overview of the book, and then I will do a short reading to give you a feel for the voice of the book, and then we can take it from there. Questions, certainly be happy to talk about anything that you have questions about. And I can also talk a little bit about the inspiration for the book, because it was inspired by my family history. So just to give you a little bit of a synopsis, The Tobacco Wives is the story of a young seamstress in 1946 North Carolina who inadvertently runs across some information and some dangerous truths about the big tobacco empire that is employing her and that's ruling the American South. The story is told through the eyes of Maddie Sykes, who's 15 years old. Her father has just died in World War II, and her mother basically has a breakdown. She doesn't know how she's going to support herself and her daughter now that her husband has died, the breadwinner of the family. And so in desperation, she takes Maddie and basically drops her off, abandons her at her great aunt Etta's house in the fictional town of Brightleaf, North Carolina. So this is the town that, I can talk about this a little later, but it's based on Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where both sets of my grandparents are from, where my parents met at R.J. Reynolds High School. So I spent a lot of time in Winston-Salem, and that was really a big part of the inspiration, and that's what Brightleaf is based on. So in Brightleaf, Maddie's aunt has this thriving sewing business, and she's the go-to seamstress for everyone in town, including women who have been filling in for men at the cigarette factories. So the workers have taken over while the men were at war, and also just, she does alterations for regular folks around town, but she really makes her money sewing for the wives of Brightleaf tobacco executives. And these are the women that everyone in town calls the tobacco wives. So Maddie arrives, dropped off at Aunt Etta's, was not expecting to be there at this time of year. This is like Tobacco Wives prime season for Aunt Etta. And Maddie does visit her every summer, and she helps her with sewing, but this is kind of not a great time. But they try to make the most of it. And through a series of events, Maddie ends up having to fill in for her aunt and for these women. And she basically gets drawn into the world of these wealthy women. She's working for them, and she begins to see that things are not as perfect as they first appear to be. And she also is exposed to the factory workers and conditions there and the life of the working women. And she comes across some information that she basically is not supposed to see. And she has to decide what to do with that in a town where everyone depends on big tobacco. So that's in a nutshell, without giving away too much, what the Tobacco Wives is about. And I thought now I would read a short passage for you all. This is about 50 pages into the book. Maddie has just been dropped off at her aunt's, and she's, for the first time, going inside the tobacco cigarette factory with her aunt. Her aunt has to drop off some patches for the uniforms for the workers. So this is Maddie's kind of first peek inside the factories. All employees at the Brightleaf factories were required to dress in nearly identical uniforms, with special patches sewn onto the breast pocket like a badge. The patch announced the type of work performed and was a point of pride for many of the employees, especially the ones who had hard scrabbled their way up out of the fields to the better jobs on the manufacturing line. A group of men stood outside the factory entrance, smoking. "Who's this pretty young thing?" the smallest of them called. "Are you spoken for, doll?" the other men snickered. "Get back to work, Lloyd," said a tall fellow with leathery skin. "She's too young even for you." He punched baby-faced Lloyd lightly on the arm as the rest of them laughed. Aunt Etta peered into the door's small window and knocked. We were buzzed through, and once inside, a woman sitting at a high wooden desk asked Aunt Etta to present identification and sign a ledger book. "She with you?" she said, referring to me. "Yes, ma'am, she's my assistant." Assistant. I liked the sound of that. The lady came out from behind the desk to stand beside us, a cigarette in one hand and a weighty ring of keys in the other. She was a slim, dark-skinned woman with a shock of gray hair and glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, and an air of authority that suited her. She led us down a long hallway and, reaching a locked metal door, made a performance of searching for just the right key. "There you are," she said, holding open the door for us without crossing the threshold herself. No sooner had Aunt Etta and I stepped onto the factory floor when my eyes began to water. The air reeked of mint. My throat burned like nobody's business, and the inside of my nose felt like it had been painted by a lit match. "What is that?" I shouted over the whirring of the machines. "What's that smell?" I had asked Aunt Etta, but it was a man working next to us who yelled back, "Darlin', that's a smell of money," he hollered over the racket. That line came directly from my father, by the way. That actually happened to him. He worked in the cigarette factories as a teenager. So I always try to give him credit for that. So, "Darling, that's a smell of money," he hollered. His smile revealed a mouthful of yellowing teeth. "Corn mint oil," Aunt Etta said, wiping her eyes. "You get used to it." We walked between rows of clanking machines and conveyor belts, each one manned by a worker, some standing and some sitting on high stools. They wore matching khaki jackets with green cuffs and collars, the women in skirts, the men in slacks. The wooden floor was worn in spots where workers had scuffed their feet or scooted up their stools. I don't know what I'd expected, but it wasn't this. Factory works hard, everybody knows that, but it was painful just walking through here. How the workers could spend all day, every day here was beyond me. Get used to it? No, thank you. Women's fingers flew across the conveyor belts, pulling out cigarettes here and there and throwing them into baskets on the floor. "They're inspectors," Aunt Etta shouted over the noise, "looking for stems or loose filters." One of the women smiled at me, her fingernails worn to the quick, a few of them taped up with blood seeping through. "Doris here's one of the fastest. Isn't that right, Doris? 900,000 a day?" Aunt Etta said. "What?" Doris yelled, her fingers still flying. Aunt Etta shook her head, waved her off like, "Never mind. She can't hear a lick," she told me. 10-hour days in here will do that to you." Farther down the line, workers in white gloves scooped up cigarettes, lining them side by side in metal trays. They scooped and stacked, the motion almost graceful. When they saw Aunt Etta, they smiled. A few of them pointed to their jackets and gave her a thumbs up. I puffed up a little, knowing that last summer I had cut and sewed some of their uniforms myself. The break room at the end of the long line of machines, the break room was at the end of the long line of machines, a small wood paneled area with a flimsy door. Inside were fold out chairs, a cigarette machine, a sink, and a water fountain. A bin of cigarettes, light green, all of them broken or misshaped, sat on a long table next to books of matches. Maybe I could sneak one when Aunt Etta wasn't looking. I'd been smoking since I was 12. All my friends too. The adults likely knew, but there was an unwritten rule that girls didn't do it in public until we completed schooling or got married, whichever came first. A large advertisement for Moments, this is the new cigarette that's coming out with for Moments, was tacked up on a cork bulletin board in the break room. In it, a man in a white doctor's coat wearing a stethoscope around his neck proudly held up a pack of the new cigarettes, while a gorgeous blonde next to him held one between her ruby red lips. Just what the doctor ordered, the caption read. So there is a little taste of the Tobacco Wives. As I mentioned, it's the story is told through the eyes of Maddie through her first person point of view. She's 15 years old, and you really, the reader gets to go on this journey with her over the course of one summer. And while the book deals with tobacco, with women's rights, with corporate greed, I mean, it deals with all of these issues, but really at its heart, it's a coming of age story of this young girl, of Maddie, and her growth over the course of this summer, and her really her finding her voice during the course of these events. So I would be happy to answer some questions, or I could keep talking and tell you about the inspiration. What do you think, Katie?
I would love to know more about the inspiration for this book and where your
Okay.
characters came from, and because there are quite a
Sure.
few characters.
There are quite a few. There are several wives. There are, excuse me. So sure, I'd be happy to talk about that. So the book was inspired by my childhood growing up in North Carolina. I lived in Asheville for most of my life, but my grandparents, both sets of them, lived in Winston-Salem, and that's where my parents were born and raised. And I spent a lot of time there. And I feel, and I still feel, very connected to Winston. And one of my grandmothers was a hairdresser for the wives of R.J. Reynolds tobacco executives in the 1940s. And I was always fascinated as a little girl by the idea of these women. I kind of idolized them. And I don't know, it's funny, my grandmother was actually very religious. And so I would always bother her to give me some gossip and dirt on these women, because when someone's doing your hair, or in a situation where you're a seamstress for someone way back then, you have this like rapport and this intimate relationship where you end up telling each other a lot of things, I think. And so I was just sure that she must have some really great stories. And she would usually kind of deflect and quote like a Bible verse about how gossip is a sin, instead of actually giving me any good dirt. So I think in many ways, Mama, we called her Mama, inspired me to make up my own stories about the wives. And so my other grandmother across town was a seamstress. And she specialized in evening gowns and wedding gowns. And so I also grew up around her and around all the work that she was doing. And I must say, some readers have asked me if I sew, and because there's so much about sewing, my main character is a seamstress, but I do not sew. I had to do quite a bit of research to make that believable in the book, and hopefully it is. um, I did help my grandmother some in the summers, and I think that's where those kind of memories came from and the inspiration, but I did not help the way that Maddie helps in this book. um, and then, so those were kind of the initial kind of sparks of inspiration from my childhood. I went to journalism school at UNC Chapel Hill. I graduated, I moved to New York and started working in public relations and later in advertising. And I had always wanted to write a book. And during those years, I focused mostly on short stories. And I had written a short story about these women, about the tobacco wives. And at the time, my writing teacher wrote some notes on the back of this. And I actually found this story recently. It was printed out on real paper, not just on the computer. It was back in 2000. And she had written on the back some comments. And one of the comments was, I think there may be a longer piece here. It feels like there may even be a novel. And that was one of those moments, when you have those moments in life where a teacher or someone like says something to you that like plants this seed with you. And that stuck with me, kind of filed it away. A lot of my creative energy was going into my work during those years and trying to build a career and pay rent in New York. And so I always had some kind of writing going on, but it wasn't until many, many years later that I decided it was time for me to really try to write a novel. And that was about 8 years ago. And so as I started to work on it, I began doing research. I began talking to family members who were still living. And that's when it started getting really interesting, because my father in particular, my grandparents are no longer alive, but I have a lot of pictures, I have letters and family stories that have been handed down, and my father was able to convey a lot of those. And so, for instance, the scene that I just read of Maddie going into the factory, that's based on my father's experience. When he was a teenager, he worked in the cigarette factories, and he talked about they had an area where they were making the menthol cigarettes, so the mint, and just how painful that was. And even the line where he said that he asked, like, what is that? What's that smell? And someone said, son, that's the smell of money. And so I said, oh, Dad, can I steal that, please? Because I feel like a lot of these really great details come from primary research and interviews when you talk to people. And then there's some other details that were kind of alarming, actually, that are in the book about some practices in the factories. There was actually one factory that was under lock and key. They had armed guards there, and only certain people had clearance to go in. And the reason is that they would take the bits of tobacco, whatever had fallen on the floor in the first factory, and they would sweep it up and bag it up and take it to the second factory and cook it and create what is called reconstituted cigarettes or tobacco. And it's called recon for short. And so there's a scene in the book where Maddie learns about that and is kind of horrified. So she's, I'm talking a lot about the factory, but she also is experiencing the wealth of the tobacco wives. They're a group of 4 women who she gets to know. And someone says, recon tobacco sounds horrifying. Yes, it does sound horrifying. And yeah, and it's disturbing too to hear it, like the personal story. It's one thing to read about it online, but to actually hear, and they would use that, the recon, for the non-branded cigarettes. So it's kind of the lesser varieties. and they kept it quiet. And I mean, of course, now you can find all of this information online. It's public knowledge now, but I still think a lot of people, readers I've spoken with, are surprised by some of these details in the book. So the book really grew as I did this research. And I also, there's a whole element of the book also about not only the emerging science about the dangers of smoking, but the fact that the tobacco companies used advertising in order to mislead the public about cigarettes. And they, and you know, because my field and I've worked in advertising and PR for so many years, that whole element was interesting to me as well. And I don't think it's really been explored necessarily. And I also don't know of any other books that explore the rise and fall of big tobacco from the perspective, from a female perspective. And so that was also really interesting to me to tell that story. And and to not tell it, I feel like everything that's out there, movies and what you read, it focuses a lot on the male executives in tobacco and the companies, and vilifies them with valid reason, of course. But it really struck me as I talked to my father about working and in these factories and what it was like to live in Winston-Salem during that time, right before they began to find out how dangerous it was. And he talked about it with such pride. And he said, you know, everyone smoked, every Hollywood star, every film you looked at. I mean, the advertising at the time, there were doctors in the ads recommending cigarettes. And it was just part of the culture. It was part of life. And they really did not know it was dangerous, which is hard to believe now. But I talked to him about that. And he said that as difficult as the work was in the factories, that people were still incredibly proud that those were coveted jobs that paid very well and that fueled the whole city. And so every hospital, every school, every good thing was funded by tobacco money during that time. And so that kind of took the book in an interesting direction for me, because I tried to put myself in the shoes of these hardworking people who had built this business. You know, how would they feel when they start to learn that what they're doing for a living and their pride and joy and something that seems so natural, growing, you know, a gift of the earth, tobacco, is actually dangerous and is hurting people, making them sick, and even killing them. And so that dilemma began to become kind of at the core of the book as well. So hopefully I've given you a little bit of a taste, and I'd be happy to discuss.
I would love to know a little bit more about your research process. I know you said that you talked to your dad a lot, and but I'd like to know, well, I mean, you do a lot with the gowns, the dresses,
Mhm.
then there's the society lady aspect of it.
Right.
And
Right.
and where did your research come from? And also, was there anything that was particularly surprising that you uncovered in the process of the research, or something that just took you in a completely different direction that you had uncovered?
Right. Right. Yeah, it's interesting. There are a number of things that that, because I discovered them in research, ended up becoming part of the plot and the story. I I talked to family members, but I also, you know, did a lot of research into big tobacco, into advertising at the time. I mean, you can find so much online. I was able to read the congressional hearing testimony from when the tobacco executives were finally held accountable many years later. and had to testify before Congress. I was able to find copies of memos that tobacco executives had written. And a lot of at that time, the investigation was focused on whether they knew that that cigarettes are addictive, and they continue to deny knowing that they were addictive. And I believe still do, now that vaping and e-cigarettes are a thing. Like, nicotine addiction is still a very real issue. It just comes in a different form now. And then there were a number of books that I found. There was one that was written by the great grandson of R.J. Reynolds, the founder of Reynolds Tobacco. His name is Patrick Reynolds. And actually it's funny. I found him and reached out to him a couple of months ago. He's the one member of the family that broke away from them and denounced the family business. And he started an organization called tobaccofree.org. And he started this whole movement and campaign to help stop smoking. And I thought that was fascinating. And there was a book that he co-wrote with another author called The Gilded Leaf. And it was about him and his experience and his family. And so I relied on that book quite a bit. But I reached out to him a couple of months ago to thank him for the book and to offer to send him a copy of mine. And he just wrote me back like 2 days ago. He's a busy guy. Okay. But yeah, I thought it was great just to like be in touch with him. And I also am a very visual person. And so my research also entailed, going through not only old photos that I have of my grandparents and of Winston-Salem during that time, but I also put together Pinterest boards for all different kinds of aspects of the book. Like, for instance, there's a 4th of July party at one point in the book and a birthday party, kind of a combination. So I was able to pull all these different photos of parties during those years in the 1940s in the South. And even for the inside of the home where Mrs. Winston, the kind of the main tobacco wife, where she lived, I was able to get old photos of bedrooms and parlors and different, different areas of the home. And so a lot of that really inspired me as well. And then the sewing, I watched a lot of sewing videos actually on YouTube and blogs. And I mean, I really enjoy the research part of it. There were a couple of things that ended up in the book that were surprising to me. One of them is that there's this condition called the green monster. It's nicknamed. And it is a condition that that the workers in the fields would get when they were handling the tobacco. So one of the things I studied also was the whole process of growing and tending to tobacco. And it's very labor intensive, and you have to go through and remove certain leaves and take the tops off of the plants, which is called suckering. And the leaves themselves would seep nicotine into the worker's skin. And so even if a leaf just brushed up against you, you would take in nicotine into your body. And it was a form of nicotine poisoning that was nicknamed the green monster. So, so that ended up in the book. And that's something that I love when I read and I'm kind of transported to another world. I love learning little things like that I never would have known otherwise.
Yeah, I was very interested in the plight of the workers and sort of the complicated nature of that, with the women sort of replacing the men and enduring these terrible conditions, and how nobody seems to really be doing anything about that, and maybe even making it a little worse.
Yes.
And that, I think for them, it was a very different experience than it was for the wives themselves. did
Yes.
not have their hands on it and did not have
Right.
all of that going on.
Right, right. And I wanted to really juxtapose those two groups. And one of the things I thought a lot about is the fact that although the wealthy wives of these executives did have very privileged lives, they lived in mansions, they had plenty of money. Um, when it really came down to it, as I researched women's lives during that time in the 40s, they really had very little true power or agency over their own lives. Um, and I actually thought it was interesting as I began to learn more about life for women when men were away in World War II and all the opportunities. I mean, I think we all know about Rosie the Riveter, and women are going to step in, and that was such a critical period in our history. And that's why I set the book right at the end of World War II, because I thought that would create this tension of the men coming back and wanting and expecting their jobs back. So they and the executives at Bright Leaf Tobacco in this book wanted things to go back to the way they were. Women, okay, we don't need you anymore. And yet these women, even though the conditions were horrendous, they were making money, their own money, for the first time in their lives, probably most of them, and getting that sense of satisfaction that comes with knowing that you can do that and that you can support yourself. And so at times I kind of weighed, well, who is the more fortunate? You would think the workers are less fortunate, but really they are getting an experience that these wealthy women don't have. It was really frowned upon for any wealthy woman to choose to work, because that would mean that your husband couldn't support you. So
I think that's such an interesting thing to explore too, because in one of the things I found very interesting in the book was the outside influences of other women on Maddie's life, because she doesn't really come from money. And I think
right.
about her mother trying to discourage her from being independent and going off onto the world on her own and having her own aspirations. And then I think of, one of the wives really encouraging her to find her own voice and like, here's this little thing, like, explore this.
Right.
And then
Right.
there's the other one who seems to be I'm trying not to give too much away. So,
Right. Right.
who's sort of somewhere in the middle and is like, well, let me give you a little bit of taste of this side of life, but also start thinking for yourself. Like, it was
Right.
interesting how she was sort of thrown in three different directions by the women who had influence over her.
Yes. Yes. Very true. Um, yeah, I enjoyed having this, group of women who could influence her in different ways. And also just to have her eyes opened to, I mean, she really experienced these kind of the polar opposite, like the working class experience and the factory workers, and then the very wealthy women. But among those women, some were more progressive than others. And, had different things. I feel like she learned something different from each of them, just from being around them and kind of seeing what their lives were really like.
Yeah, and I think it was interesting that you made the decision to have the one that on the surface seemed the most conservative be maybe the one who is most progressive in a lot of ways.
Yes, yes. I had fun with, I assume you're talking about Cornelia.
Yes, I
Yes,
am.
I love her.
I really enjoyed her as a character because I was like, "Ooh, she sounds tough, man." Like,
Yeah, I love her. When people ask, I mean, she was one of my favorite characters to write. She's an older, woman, kind of the matriarch of the group, and she's very blunt and a little bristly, but at at her heart, I think she's a good person, and she sees something in Maddie and decides to try to kind of mentor her in a way.
Yeah, she's a fun character to read. I have a question here from Katie who says, I'm curious about your writing process, and was writing the parts about the babies a difficult part to write? It was difficult to read without crying.
Oh, it was difficult to write. And whoops, we lost the visual for Katie. But yes, that was difficult, and I have some experience with that myself, and that I could draw upon. And sorry, I'm looking at the other comment. What am I working on now? Yeah, so the baby part was difficult. I also had to do some research to find out what things were like in maternity hospitals during those years, and what the environment was like, and whether they even had, the ability to help premature infants survive. So that was tough. My writing process, I mean, I mentioned earlier, I've been working on this book for many, many years, not consecutively and not every day, of course. I worked full time. I'm married. I have a son who's now 16 years old. And so I really had to kind of carve out time. I usually would spend time on the weekends, like blocks of time writing. And then I would like print out chapters and carry them around with me during the week on my way to work, on my way home, at lunch. I would be scribbling notes, and so I kind of came up with my own way to make it work with my schedule. I know a lot of writers have a regular schedule, like they'll get up every morning and write at 6 a.m. or 5 a.m. or something, and that just didn't work for me. I found that it was better for me, and I think I'm kind of always, when I'm working on a project, I'm kind of always thinking about the characters, and they're kind of always in the back of my mind. And so sometimes it's helpful to just get to a certain point with the writing and then go about my life, and ideas will come to me often when I'm doing something physical, like when I'm taking a shower or taking a walk. And I think there's actually research into creativity that shows that's how creativity works, that you kind of immerse yourself in a challenge or a problem or something, and then walk away from it, and then things will start to pop into your mind. So that's what would happen for me, is I'd be on the subway or walking my son to school, and I would say, oh, Cornelia, I know I have an image of Cornelia now, and I go to, get that down. So, and someone else asked what I'm working on now. I'm actually starting research, and I'm starting to outline a second book, which I'm really excited about. And it's very different this time. I feel like I've learned so much during the process of the first book. And I had so much time for it to kind of grow and evolve. And now I think more of the mechanics. Like I've been working on an outline, like a whole plot, like plotting out, and it may not end up being true to the outline. In fact, I doubt it will. But but when I wrote the first book, I had no idea where I was going. It was kind of just, okay, let me get something down on paper. And the book, the original manuscript, from the time that I started pitching agents and got an agent, and then we sold it in to a publisher and started working with my editor, it changed quite a bit, the story. And there was a lot of editing. There were a lot of really helpful suggestions and ideas that my agent and my editor had that ended up making the book a lot better.
what have you learned in that process? So now, do you think that outlining is going to be the way forward for you from now on? Or is it something that you wish
Well,
you had done in the first place? Or
I don't think I mean, I actually, I didn't, I tried to outline with the first book. There was a book that someone recommended to me. It's called Right Away. And it's written by an author who, I think I have it right here. Um,
I
Elizabeth
love
George.
when authors do this.
You do? All
By
right.
the way.
Elizabeth George.
Okay.
She has written New York Times bestselling author of many, many mysteries. And so this book, it says one novelist's approach to fiction and the writing life. And she, like, there's a whole chapter on plotting, there's a chapter on characters where she talks about, it's basically her process. And when I first decided, okay, I really want to do this, I used this book and I didn't follow everything, but I started with character and place and situation. I already knew I wanted to write about these women. And there were some really useful tools in here, things like a whole questionnaire to fill out on your characters. So things that you may not ever end up on the page or in the book, but help you as a writer understand your characters. So what is their greatest fear? What's their favorite food? Did they, how many siblings do they have? I mean, what's their favorite, what are their hobbies? I mean, just really creating this full-fledged character and person. So I focused more on character, place, and situation with the first book. And part of why I'm also focused on the outline is for the second book, instead of having a whole manuscript done, what I will do is I will talk with my publisher and share kind of the synopsis and probably several chapters. And then based on that, we'll hopefully move forward and I'll be busy writing the rest of it.
It's always interesting to me to hear how authors go about doing that sort of thing. Like in the last couple of author discussions I've had, one was like, I write from beginning to end and will write this terrible novel, and that I will start from the beginning and edit all the way to the end and change everything that needs to be.
Right.
Or another one will say, I created these characters and had no idea where they were going, so had to figure it out from here on out. So it's always interesting to
Yeah.
me to hear how the story develops, how the characters develop, like how all of that comes to be. And it seems like everybody has a completely different way of doing it. And I
I
find that
do.
fascinating.
I do too. I really do. I find it fascinating as well. Um, yeah. And I mean, and it continues to evolve as continue to work on the story. And then as you get closer to publication, I'll give you one example of a change, a big change, is that when I was pitching my agent, the manuscript at that time, Maddie was only 12, Maddie was younger, she was 12 years old.
Oh.
And so one of the things that my agent recommended was that I age her up to 15. And so that doesn't sound like a huge change, but it basically
That's
required
really
me going back through the whole book and changing the voice, because there's a big difference between a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old and how they see the world.
yes.
And that was why she recommended it, so that Maddie would be a little bit older, more sophisticated. It's hard for me to even imagine what the book would be without that at this point, but
Yes, I feel the same way, because I feel like at 12 you don't have any of the same insights or
right.
the eye to nuance, or even like the capability of having moral dilemmas on the same level that
Right,
somebody
right,
older would have.
right. And I mean, there was also at that time, Mitzi, the main tobacco wife, had a daughter who was Maddie's age, around Maddie's age. And so the story focused more on the relationship between the two girls, on that friendship. And as you, having read the book, know, Mitzi does not have a daughter in the book. And so the daughter, her name was Virginia. Poor Virginia didn't make it in the book. Um, and it was interesting because I also got some input along the way from friends, and I have been in a book club for over 15 years. And at one point, when I felt comfortable with it, I asked my book club if they would read the manuscript for our monthly book.
That's brave.
It was terrifying. It was kind of terrifying. And I said, please be honest, but be kind. And they were. But one of the things they told me is that they weren't that interested in Virginia. They weren't that interested in the relationship between the girls. They were more interested in the tobacco wives. And so, and at the time, the title of the book was also different. It was called Brightleaf, which is the name of the town. And so I changed the title and I added more wives and got rid of the daughter. So there were like significant changes that took place.
Wow. That somebody said your book club must be so proud of you.
They are like so excited. I mean, and they've been hearing me talk about this forever and ever and ever. Like, and I had one of the members of the group had a little party for me on the day that the book came out that night, and several of them came, and it was just amazing, like amazing.
That's so great. At what point did Anthony come into the story? Because I feel like he's sort of her primary friendship.
Her friend and confidant. He was actually there in the earlier versions.
Mm-hmm.
And the three of them were friends, but I kind of gave him a bigger role after getting rid of Virginia. He like took some of her space on the
She needed a
page.
friend.
He needs, yeah, gotta have like someone to confide in. And he's very gossipy, so he was able to fill her in on a lot.
Yeah, he was a great character. I really enjoyed him. He reminded me a lot of my friends. So.
Yeah.
I have a question here saying, what book are you reading now? This is also a question I also love to ask.
Oh, yes. So I just finished The Christie Affair,
Mhm.
which is historical fiction. I met the author actually at a book festival that I went to in Tucson, Arizona. So that was very exciting. And I just finished also reading another debut novel by someone who I've become friends with. She and I share an editor, and her book came out recently. It's called Shadows of Pecan Hollow. It's by Caroline Frost. And it's another Southern book, but it's Texas. And it's like gritty, like kind of violent crime, like, but it's really good. It's very different than my book, but a great book. So those are two that I'm reading right now.
As a Brooklynite, do you consider yourself a Southern writer?
I do,
You do.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, all my
Yeah.
writing. I mean, even though I've been in New York for over 20 years now, but I'm a Southern girl at heart, and whenever I write, those are the voices that come through. And I also still spend quite a bit of time in North Carolina. My family's there, and yeah.
Excellent. Well, I feel like I've been monopolizing the questioning here. Does anybody else have any questions?
Let's see. Um,
This reader also enjoyed the Christie Affair. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or You can unmute yourself if you'd like. Do you have a favorite author? Katie wants to know.
Well, I was really inspired. Like one of the first authors and books that I remember really connecting with was I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. I think I was like 13 and I read that book and I just, it stayed with me. And so I love her. I love Pat Conroy as well. Flannery O'Connor. I mean, all these Southern voices, I think, are obviously where I where I gravitate to.
That's great. I jotted down another question as you were talking. Did you ever end up getting any good dirt from your grandmother?
Not really, no.
That's so disappointing.
I know, right? It was all my imagination.
Well, I mean, that's great, but
I
how
guess.
disappointing that you never got any good
I
dirt.
know. I know. She was not giving it up. Memo. She was not going to talk bad about her customers.
Well, I did see the pictures of your grandmothers on your website, and they
Oh,
were both, they're
yeah.
fabulous photos. They looked beautiful and glamorous, and
Yeah. I love that period of history and the clothes and it was really cute. The one picture I have on my website, if anyone wants to look, it's Adele Myers author.com. And I have a bunch of pictures of, I mean, I have pictures of my grandmother's, but then I also have pictures of ads. Um, I think it's AU.
oh my God.
OR, sorry, OR.
Yes, yes.
Um,
I can read, you know.
no, I'm double checking because a lot of time people spell Myers M-E-Y, but it's M-Y. You got the Myers right.
I just can't type is the problem.
But
I screwed it up again.
one of the pictures of my grandmother, the hairdresser, she's
Oh my,
standing in front of a
nope.
car.
I did screwed it up again. Sorry.
It's okay. But she's standing in front of a car, and I think it's so funny. One of the things I noticed is a lot of the pictures from those years, people are standing in front of cars, and it's just because it's like a prestigious thing to be standing next to a car. I don't even know if that was her car, but she was going to stand next to it and get her picture taken.
I have pictures of my grandparents standing in front of their cars as well in the 40s.
Yeah, it was like a whole thing. And then I also have on the site that people may find interesting, I have some of the old ads that real ads that ran at the time that are just kind of shocking. Ads using doctors, smoking and saying, I only smoke Camels, they're good for your throat. There were ads that suggested that smoking was good to keep your weight down for ladies, and even to keep your weight down during pregnancy and right after, which is just horrifying. But it was really kind of the Wild West of advertising back then, and they could pretty much say whatever they wanted without fear of consequences. And thankfully now we have regulations, but I would say it's still an issue that advertising. I mean, I've worked in the field for many years, so I don't feel that advertising is inherently bad, but it can be misused, obviously, and was by the cigarette companies.
I see two questions here about signed copies. And I'm so glad you asked, because it was one of the things I was going to tell you. I'm putting a link in the chat that was pre-copied and pasted, not typed by my messy fingers. Bronx River Books is our local independent bookstore in Scarsdale, and they have agreed to stock the book, and Adele has sent some signed book plates, and
Yes.
they're also offering a 10% discount if you order through that link. So I'm hoping that that's the way that you decide to get Adele's book, because they are great to us at the library, and they're wonderful community members, and they're so easy to partner with. And yeah, absolutely buy the book from them. and get it,
That's
and you'll get a
great.
signed copy and just, oh, you did get it.
Oh, great, great, great. I think Katie, I think I was in touch with you on social media too. I believe you were the one that posted. Yes. Okay. Sure.
Um, does anybody else have any other questions? And yes, absolutely support your indie books, your local indie bookstore, because they are great members of our community.
Mhm.
Um, I don't want to hold you up much more. I have already asked you so many things, and you've given me so
Right.
much information. If nobody else has any other questions, Adele, it has been such a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, thank you. I really
I
enjoyed it.
I'm really looking forward to hearing what you're up to next. And, please feel free to be in touch. I'm in the business of book pushing, you know,
Excellent.
um, it's what we do at the library all the time. So it's always such a treat to be able to talk to somebody about the process and,
Mhm.
hear where these stories are coming from. So thank you so much for putting so much of yourself into it.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And thanks to everyone who tuned in. I really appreciate it and appreciate the support. So thanks, Katie.
Good luck with it, and good luck with your continuing everything with the
Thank
book.
you. Thank you. Yes, I can't talk much about it yet, but I will. My next book
Totally
will
understood.
be set in the South, and it will have to do with Southern discomfort. That was the nickname that my teacher gave me at one point, was Southern discomfort. So that seems to be my niche.
Was this from way before,
This
or
is from way before. Yeah.
that's hilarious. I love it. Well, again, thank you so much for your time and putting so much of yourself out there, and good luck with everything.
Thank you. Thanks. All right.
Thank you so much.
Bye.